Hey, in 1862, the United States government enacted what was called the Homestead Act, which provided for anyone who was willing to move west, it provided for them 160 acres of land if they would be willing for a 5-year period to live on the property and demonstrate that they were making improvements to the property. 160 acres of land for free. And then over that 5-year proving period, the government would come back, a government inspector would come out to see if they were actually living there and making improvements on the land. So they got it for free if they did. If they didn't prove that they either lived there or were making improvements, then they had to buy the property at the insanely exorbitant price of $1.25 an acre. So it was a pretty stiff penalty if you didn't develop the land. But cost aside, there was an interesting sociological observation that was made about the homesteaders during this era of settling the western frontier. When the homesteaders first arrived on their 160-acre parcels of property, most of them built their homes right in the middle of the property. And so I've got this little diagram that shows what things look like. So it's a little out of proportion. 160-acre plots, a house smack dab in the middle. It's not a 75-acre house. It's out of proportion. So this is what would happen inevitably at the beginning when the homesteaders would settle their property. But at the end of the 5-year period, when the government inspectors would come out to see proof of residency and improvement, this is what they discovered after 5 years, that most of the homesteaders, next slide, had moved their homes from the centers of their property to the corners of their property, adjacent to one another. Well, what was that all about? What was that all about? Well, the homesteaders grew to recognize their need to be connected with other people. They recognized that isolation was not good, and they grew to recognize that it was critically important to belong to a community, and a community that was bigger than an individual homesteader or even an individual family of homesteaders. The need for community was important. And this sociological observation is no less true of us today, 150 years later, than it was of the homesteaders. That is this: it's critically important for us to be vitally connected in community with others, community that is bigger than us as individuals and bigger than our individual family units as well. Isolation is not good. It wasn't good 150 years ago. Isolation is still not good for us today. And this morning we're going to see that even Jesus himself demonstrated and modeled for us this critical need to be relationally connected, to be vitally connected with other people. I mean, think about this. Not even Jesus lived in isolation from relationships. Now, I want you to listen to this, especially for those of you who have already begun to tune out, right? You know, those of you who reckon yourselves to be ruggedly independent. If ever there was an individual, if ever there was a human being who could have been ruggedly independent, it was Jesus, right? If ever a human being could have honestly said, you know what, I really don't have any need for friends in my life, it would have been Jesus. I really don't have the need to hang out with a group of people. My Father and I are really close. And we've been really close. I would say best friends for, let's see how long. Oh yeah, forever. We have been best friends forever. We talk about everything. My Father has never, ever let me down. He's always been there for me. He is always going to be there for me. And when I say always, I literally mean always, right? So if ever there was anyone who was capable of living a life of rugged independence, it was Jesus. If anyone had a legitimate reason to opt out of community with other people, it was Jesus. But what we see is something completely different. In his time on earth, Jesus demonstrated in his own life, he modeled for us the critical importance of being connected in community. And this morning, what we're going to look at are several important ingredients of Christian community that we see modeled in Jesus' life himself. And so our text this morning comes from Matthew 26. I'll read just verses 36 through 38 this morning. Then Jesus brought them, that's his band of buddies, a larger band of buddies. Then Jesus brought them to an olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go on ahead to pray." Now, the context, you understand, is shortly before his crucifixion. And he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, so three buddies, Peter, James, and John, and he began to be filled with anguish and deep distress. And he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here, just stay here and watch with me." Well, I think we're going to pick up from that point next week, but we'll see how it goes. In Jesus' example in these verses, I want you to observe a couple ingredients of authentic community, authentic Christian community. And the first ingredient we see modeled for us in Jesus' example is the importance, the need, I would even say the necessity of this small circle of connection. I want to call it the need for intimacy, the ingredient of intimacy in the community of faith. Again, just reading the passage for him. Jesus brought them to an olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here a while I go ahead to pray." And so again, this was a larger group of people. This might have been like his church, so to speak, a big group of people that was following at this time. But out of that large group, Jesus took aside three buddies, Peter, James, and John, and he began to reveal to them, hey, this is what's going on with me right now. So he took some buddies aside. And we see him in Jesus' example then, this need to be connected with a smaller group of people. And that's significant when you think about it, in spite of the fact that Jesus was actually pretty popular, right? He was a celebrity speaker of sorts. He had groupies following him everywhere he went. Huge fan club. And in spite of the fact that beyond just having this huge fan club, he had, as I said before, this smaller church of people. We know from the Gospel of Luke, for instance, that it was at least 70. He was in a church of at least 70 people that were following him around as he ministered. But in spite of these crowd connections that Jesus had in his life, when Jesus came to a point where he knew he was going to be facing some tough life circumstances, he pulled aside some close buddies that he had been cultivating relationship with during, his entire earthly ministry. Jesus knew that the kind of personal support and interpersonal connections that he was going to need in this "my soul is anguished to the point of death" season, it was not the kind of connection that you got in a crowd. Understand that? He knew the crowd isn't capable of supporting me in this season. I need some close buddies. And so Jesus knew that you can't belong in a crowd when we're going through the kind of life crises that Jesus knew he was going to be going through. We have to have a closer connection of support around us. Listen, I'm going to put some cards on the table this morning, okay? Are you okay with that? Right? There are a lot of people who call the Vineyard Community Church their church home. And by using that phrase, you mean you attend here on Sunday mornings. That's what you mean by calling the Vineyard your church home. But this place is a crowd on Sunday mornings. This is a crowd. This is not a connection on Sunday mornings. You cannot belong here. You can't, you know what I mean by that? You can't belong. You can be a number in a crowd, but you can't be known here. You can't know in a crowd. If your connectedness to the body of Christ, if your connectedness to this body of Christ is merely crowd connectedness, then you don't have the kind of interpersonal connections in your life with other believers that you need to have for whatever life may throw your direction. You just don't have the kind of relationships that we saw that Jesus himself had cultivated. And the best place for that to happen, if you're part of this church, is in small groups, Alpha, Beta, Vine, or the groups that are on the display table in the back. So belonging to a small circle of connection, it's God's answer for isolation in our lives. It's God's answer for loneliness in our lives. I think every one of us knows that it's actually quite easy to be in a huge crowd of people like this and yet feel completely alone. Nobody knows me. Nobody knows what I'm going through right now, right? So small group of connection is God's answer to loneliness. It's isolation. And it's also God's answer just to wiser living. It's smarter to be connected to a small group of people. It's safer to be connected with a small group of people. You know, a herd, so to speak, a flock or something like that, a smaller, right? We know the story that the animals in the flock, in the pack, right, that are isolated from being connected with those are the ones who get picked off, right? We know this. We've seen the Wild Kingdom or whatever the TV shows were, right? It's the exact same way in the pack of Christ. If you're isolated from connection with other believers, you're the first person the devil's going to try to pick off. That's who he's going to go for, the isolated Christian. And so it's safer, it's just smarter to be connected with other believers. And it's more sustaining. We're more likely to go the distance in the Christian life when we have some buddies who are walking beside us. You've heard me quote the Zambian proverb before. In Zambia, they say, when you run alone, you can run fast. But when you run together, you can run far. When you run alone, you can run fast, but when you run together, you can run far. And so the Christian life is not a sprint. The Christian life is a marathon, and we need others around us to help us go the distance. And so community is God's answer to sustain the Christian life. Community is God's answer to fatigue in life. It's sustaining to live in intimate connection with others. And so that's the first thing that we learn from Jesus is the need for a small group connection, the need for intimacy with a small group of others. Got it? Intimacy. Nod. Okay, good. But here's the second ingredient of Christian community that we learn from Jesus' example is intentionality. Intentionality. Again, verse 38, Jesus tells this smaller group of buddies, listen, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death, so stay here. I need you guys to stay here, and I need you to watch with me. All right, there was an invitation. It was an intentional invitation. Jesus was enrolling his buddies to be near him in this moment of life. And so it was intentional effort. Jesus knew that he had to take initiative to make connections with others in the community of faith. Listen to this. Making significant connections in the community of faith is not something that happens accidentally. It rarely happens accidentally. It takes intentional effort. It takes initiative. And so this means that if you want to develop some friendships here, if you want to have some close buddies who will be there for you when you're going through a tough time in life, it just means that you're going to need to take some initiative and go meet some people. Go introduce yourself to them. Go learn their name. Let them learn your name. Give them a telephone call. Go out for a cup of coffee with them. It means you're going to need to be intentional about joining a small group, signing up, and being a part. Right? You get the idea? It's going to take intentional effort. When Jesus was facing my soul is crushed to the point of death season in life, he didn't post it as a status on his Facebook page. And just ask this, ubiquitous, ethereal crowd of friends out there to like his status, to prove they're his friends. Share this to prove that you're really my friend. Right? Jesus actually connected with real flesh and blood people. He didn't need Facebook, he needed FaceTime. in this season of life. Another card on the table. Listen to this. What I've seen happen in the church over and over again in my now near 30 years of being a pastor is this, that there are people out there in the crowd on Sunday mornings who don't put a priority on intentionally cultivating near friendships, close friendships, a close group of buddies within the community of faith. And there's always good reasons. I'm too busy. I have my spouse. I've got my family. You know, there's always something that's a good excuse for not connecting. I don't have a need for that in my life right now. Life is just generally going well. But what inevitably happens is life. Life inevitably happens. That is, they find themselves in a my soul is crushed to the point of death season in life, like a serious illness. They find out they've got cancer. They find out, their spouse is cheating on them. Their spouse abandoned them. They're facing a huge financial crisis. And in this, my soul is in anguish to the point of death, they send up this SOS flare. But because they haven't cultivated any near relationships, there is nobody who sees it. Nobody sees the SOS flare. No one responds. And they end up going through the my soul is crushed, to the point of death season in life all alone. And what inevitably happens is they get offended at the church. The church is so unfriendly. Nobody cares. Nobody cared for me. There's a promise in the Word of God. There's a way that God hardwired the universe to work, and he talks about it in Galatians, that we reap what we sow. We reap what we sow. And so if you put sweet corn in the ground, you are going to reap sweet corn, right? It's just the way. You put thistles in the ground, you're going to reap thistles, right? And so this means that if you intentionally sow into meaningful relationships, you will reap meaningful relationships. Or if we put this around another direction, if you are reaping unfriendliness in the community of faith, what are you sowing? Yeah, you're sowing unfriendliness because God said this is the way it works. Do not be deceived. God says, I'm not mocked. You reap what you sow. And so if you're reaping unfriendliness, if you're reaping the lack of care from others, what are you sowing? You're sowing the lack of care. You reap what you sow. If you're reaping disconnection from meaningful relationships with others, what did you sow? Well, you must have been sowing disconnection from meaningful relationships. And so if you want to eat sweet corn in the fall, you need to plant sweet corn in the spring. And if you want to cultivate a caring, supporting community of close buddies that are going to be there for you in the fall of life or in the winter of life, you have to cultivate that now in the spring of life when you don't think that you need that. Does it make sense? Do not be deceived. We reap what we sow. And so to switch metaphors, and I've used this before, and I will never grow tired of saying this, that the time to realize that we didn't build a safety net beneath us is not when we're in a free fall. When you're in a free fall off some tightrope, that is not the time to realize, oh, oops, I am going to splatter. And it's the same way in our relationships. The time to realize that you didn't build a safety net of close friendships in the community of faith that could catch you in a full-on free fall and support you through those difficulties. The time to realize you didn't build that is not when you're in a free fall. The time to build that safety net is right now when you think you don't need it. So second important ingredient of Christian community is intentional effort, intentionality. Say intentionality. Okay, good. The third ingredient of Christian community is transparency. transparency. We all need the power of transparency in our lives. And again, we've already seen this in Jesus' example of his own self-disclosure to his buddies in verse 38. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death." My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. And so when Jesus said this, by the way, we need to understand that Jesus wasn't necessarily prone to exaggeration, I don't think, right? I don't think he was just like being a drama queen here. The disciples were rolling his eyes like, oh, mercy, here goes Jesus again. He's such the drama, right? When Jesus said, "My soul is crushed to the point of death," that's how it really was. Jesus was just being transparent with the buddies. And I want you to notice also that, Jesus didn't do the other thing that we often do, and that's just kind of throw out a bone to our friends. "Hey, Jesus, are you doing okay?" "Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm okay." Right? When Jesus said, "My soul is crushed with crushed with grief to the point of death," that's how it really was. Jesus was being transparent with where he really was. And so this is what we learn from Jesus' example, that real Christian community, authentic friendships can only happen in the context of real transparency, of authentic transparency. I think that all of us know that there's just no life in superficiality. Right? There's no real life in Christian community where we bounce off of each other's whitewashed masks of evangelical pretense. Yeah, there's no life there. I've got my life completely together. You do too, don't you? Yes, say yes, say yes, say... Oh, no, don't be honest with me. I don't really want to know. Right? That's our masks of whitewashed evangelical pretense. It's opacity as opposed to transparency. And that kind of opacity, it produces a Christian community of posers. Just become a church of posers who look good on the outside, but we're dying on the inside. Because we can't let our images down long enough to experience real life and the real change that happens in authentic transparency. Without honest disclosure, there cannot be honest healing. There cannot be honest growth in our lives without honest transparency. So transparent community is God's answer to hypocrisy in the church. Transparent community is God's answer to pride. Transparent community is God's answer to superficiality. Transparent community is God's answer to defeat. So many of us spend our entire lives fighting internal battles all alone because we're not willing to take the risk of honest disclosure, of transparency. And so instead of taking the risk of transparency and saying things like, "Hey, would you stay here and watch with me? Because I'm really struggling with lust. I'm really struggling with pornography. I am at the verge of cheating on my spouse. Right? I've got a problem with anger. I'm addicted to pain medications. I never read my Bible. I'm just being honest with you. I never read my Bible. I just found out that I have cancer. I just honestly feel like checking out of life." Right? That's risky for us to say those sorts of things that are really going on inside with us. But instead of taking the risk of transparency, and I've said this before, we're more committed to the appearance of healthiness than the actuality of it. But those who are transparent about what's going on in their lives actually experience growth. They experience healing. The Bible says something like this: God gives grace to who? The humble. That's the transparent. God gives grace to the humble, but he opposes the posers. He opposes posers, but he gives grace to the transparent. And so this is the way it ought to be in the Christian community, is Transparency. And transparency in and of itself, by the way, it takes intentional effort, right? It takes effort to be transparent. Jesus didn't just assume that his buddies would know what's going on with them. Hey, Jesus, what's going on? Well, you don't know, right? What kind of friends are you guys? He had to tell them. He had to be intentionally transparent. And it's the same is true of Christian community. As much as we'd like to think that people can read our minds, right? Or should read our minds, that they should just know that I needed them to give me a call, that I know that I needed them, to be there for me. As much as we'd like to think that people can and should read our minds and have an omniscient awareness of what's going on in our hearts, they don't. They don't. They should, but they don't. Right? God knows our needs before we even ask. Our friends are not God. We have to ask. We have to be transparent. And so transparency is an essential ingredient of Christian community, and the best place for that to happen is in a small group. You can't be transparent in a crowd. The best place for it to happen is with a small group of buddies. All right, lastly, and then quickly, checking the time. This is not the time. Oh, we're in great shape. Last ingredient, I said lastly and quickly, lastly and slowly, prayer. The ingredient of prayer, verse 38, once again. We're going to spend this whole morning in verse 38. Jesus said, "Stay here and watch with me." And when he said these words, watch, he was certainly asking the small group of buddies to be praying for him. Now, this is one of the many places in the Bible that will bake your brain when you really stop to think about this. That Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Son of God, was asking some human buddies to pray for him. Right? Does that bake your brains? Like, Jesus needed prayer? Jesus needed prayer. Jesus wanted his friends to be praying for him. Right? So listen to this. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed a small group of buddies to be praying for him, guess what? You do too. I do too. We need the power of a small group of praying buddies in our lives. We need to be significantly, vitally, meaningfully connected with a small group of other believers who can be for us the conduit of God's power through prayer. The conduit of God's voice in those times when we're having trouble hearing God's voice. The conduit of God's presence in those seasons when we don't think he's close by. Jesus needed that in his life. How could we possibly think that we don't? Who here is better equipped to do life than Jesus? Okay? Jesus needed buddies in his life to pray for him, and so do we. And so this fourth ingredient of Christian community that we learn from Jesus' example is prayer. We need the power of praying buddies in our lives. And once again, the best place to cultivate that is in a small group. So be intentional about joining a small group. So I'm actually going to wrap up here. I'm going to have the worship team come forward. Ministry team's going to be in the back of the room. And I want to close with this illustration. A couple winters ago, there was a bad snowstorm that hit the southeastern portion of the United States, North Carolina, and down in Georgia. And as you know, they're not used to getting snow down there. And it was like a 6-inch snowfall. It was very heavy, very wet snowfall. And I remember seeing these photographs of, these piney woods, the Georgia piney woods. Georgia piney woods. It's a bluegrass song. Anybody know the Georgia piney woods? Lonesome for them Georgia piney woods. But anyway, where there were clusters of Georgia piney woods together, and they had this heavy 6 inches of snow for them, you could see the pines weighed down under this heavy snow, but they were standing strong. But in the same picture, you'd see these isolated Georgia piney woods trying to bear the weight of this snowfall, and they were just ripped to shreds. Branches down on the ground, they look scraggly. And it's just this perfect illustration that, no one was ever meant to bear the weight of life in isolation. That we need community. We're stronger when, our branches, so to speak, of our lives are interwoven with a close band of people around us who can help us bear the weight of whatever life may throw at us. And so be intentional, be transparent, be prayerful about our need to be connected with others. And so let's stand together, and we'll wrap up right here.